It's going to start out by reaching across the aisle, especially if the door on the other side has been shut in our face. And sometimes, you just have to be willing to call evil out for what it is. Because when I took that oath of office to protect the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic, it never sunset. I will do it now, tomorrow, until the day I die.
Let me be clear about one thing. A true leader never, never, never compromises on their values. Never compromises on their values. But at the same time is always driving towards solutions. Now, I believe your question was, did Pam and I differ on immigration policy? And the answer to that question, I think, is really only in a matter of approach. I see a situation right now where we are dealing with children, babies, who are no older than my daughter, who's not yet 2 years old, who are separated from their parents. And my first concern would be the pragmatics of getting those kids back to their parents, getting our law enforcement enforcing the law. I don't want to grandstand talking about locking up cabinet officials instead of doing the realistic hard work it's going to take to fix our immigration system now. I am never going to promise to you that I will do something that I can't arguably do from my position as a member of Congress.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to move on to the algae crisis. Just a short time ago, I'm not sure if you're aware, but Congressman Mast asked for FEMA help because of the situation that's going on right now. I saw the map of the satellite imagery from NOAA back in June, where Lake Okeechobee had no algae. Now it has more than 90%. This has been affecting people for years. I went with the River Kids to Washington, D.C., where they brought their message to Congressman Mast. So they brought their message to Congressman Mast. He listened. There were some other congressmen who listened as well. What is your plan to address this issue, since it has been around for so many decades, I believe, because it started, with sugar? Mm-hmm. Sugar money. So that's why that's why the water is flowing to the west and flowing to the east, the Treasure Coast. There have been so many people who have said to me, I want my future generations of my family to enjoy what I've been able to enjoy. So many families have said that. So obviously this applies to anyone here who believes in that whole system. So, Ms. Keith, how do you go ahead and protect our ecosystem or get us away from this crisis, which it seems no one has been able to do?
Well, that's because we've been taking the wrong approach. And the good news is I have a plan. You see, it has 3 parts. Instead of convincing Floridians who already know what our problem is, we need to convince the people who hold the purse strings of appropriations to actually appropriate the projects that we need to send water down south.
Issues, and they often get conflated. One is the issue of discharging dirty water from Lake Okeechobee into the St. Lucie River. And we deal with that by building an EAA reservoir south of the lake, by funding that reservoir, by funding appropriations for the SERP plan, which we've had since 2000, and by ensuring that the water goes south. Now, there's a second problem that we have, and that's why is there algae there in the first place? And that is because we have for decades allowed people to dump into Lake Okeechobee. Sugar from the south, industry from the north, and we've got to deal with that. Brian Mast doesn't talk about that issue. He is taking votes specifically that allow chemical pollutants to drop more chemicals into our water. We're never going to solve our algae problem unless we put hard limits on the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in our water, unless we deal with septic tank conversion in Martin County, unless we move us to a cleaner water system.
Who is going... If a person who's told me this has been around since the 50s, 60s, they may be correct. I didn't do a fact check on that. But if it's been around for so long, how do one of you think that you're going to be able to get involved to solve that problem?
I mean, I think the first thing you have to admit is that Tallahassee has been in control of the GOP for 20 years. We've been under the thumb of Rick Scott, and it's all been bamboozlement from top to bottom when it comes to caring for our environment. So we voters have to make a better choice of who we send into positions of power, because those choices matter every single day. I think Lauren is right. We do have a bunch of problems, but what we have is a representative of Florida's 18th congressional district that giveth with one hand and taketh away with the other, because he feels like gutting revenue is the right way to fund the programs that we need, which is the 180 of the truth.
Let's be clear, algae may have been around for a long time, but our problem is getting worse. Why? An algae bloom requires three things: water, nutrients, namely nitrogen and phosphorus, and heat. And what's been happening over the last 50 years? Our climate has been getting hotter, because we've dealt with climate change denialists in Tallahassee and climate change denialists in Washington. So lest you think that this problem we're dealing with here on Lake Okeechobee is disconnected from the broader problem of how we are dealing with climate change, whether we are moving to a low carbon and clean energy future, and whether we are keeping and enforcing and enhancing our environmental protections, or doing what Brian Mast and Republicans in Florida and in Washington have done for decades and roll those back, this is what it's going to take. It's going to take actual environmentalists in D.C. to make a change here.
Ms. Keith, anything to add? I know that you've been more aware and attentive to the time than I have.
I would absolutely echo the sentiment that every choice that we make has a ramification in our district. Absolutely, we have to understand that pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, while it seemed flashy and interesting, it did the opposite of what we need in this district. Gutting the EPA, totally flashy, and oh, I'm cutting regulations. Yeah, but you're also polluting the environment. The thing is that Brian was supposed to be going to Washington to represent us. You know, that's what his job was. The chemical companies have lobbyists. They have somebody who speaks for them. The corporations have lobbyists. They have somebody speaking for them. He was supposed to be speaking for us. And instead, he's taken money from those very same interests, and he has helped them accomplish their goals instead of helping us accomplish ours. And so we have to be real clear about this. We need a change in leadership, a change in representation, and a change in attitude. That's it.
That's it. Okay,
That's it.
So we'll move on to climate change, as you brought up a little moment earlier. We talk about the sea levels rising. We'll need to essentially update our infrastructure and, combat the threat of the frequent flooding. How can we go ahead and combat climate change if indeed you do believe in it?
Well, yes, I believe in climate change because climate change is a scientific fact. And let's be clear here, we're not just talking about sea level rise and flooding. This is an existential crisis for the state of Florida. The latest projections show that in 50 years, all of Florida that is below 6 inches above sea level will be underwater. That's an economic crisis of epic proportions for our state. That undermines our very way of life. That changes our geography. So it's not just about re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement, because guess what? That was a voluntary agreement that depended upon countries making their own domestic changes. We can go now back to the standards that the Obama administration set. We can stop rolling back environmental protections, and instead we can enforce them. We can move towards a clean energy future, and by the way, that's beneficial not only for the country, but for Florida, because guess what we have in abundance? Sun.
Ms. Keith, how can we, as you get up, how can we combat this?
Look,
How do we roll this back?
Quite frankly, Obama undershot it. Those regulations were still unambitious enough. And look, I understand that having a clean energy grid is important, but can we please accept the fact that we have cars that burn fossil fuels all over our roads, and that we have the technology right here, right now, to have electric cars and clean cars that don't do that? We shoot too low. We're supposed to be the leaders of the world when it comes to new technology and clean energy. So as far as I'm concerned, Paris Climate Accord may have been voluntary. It was a step in the right direction, but the United States can take a much bigger step and can do so right now if it stops counting down to car companies that don't want to face a future that is fossil fuel free.
I want to move on to something that everyone has been talking about since February 14th, and that's the Stoneman Douglas massacre. So we'd like to talk about public education and safety. I just wanted to see where I had some notes. We talked locally about Fort Pierce Central High School, 3,000 plus students, 5 to 8 guidance counselors for the entire school, who are talking about college, I would imagine. Let's see. At this school, entrances were locked down that weren't before or after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. You couldn't go through certain entrances that were blocked off. I asked someone, do you feel safer? They said yes, apart from external security measures. Now, teachers required to lock out things down, sign out sheets. Do you think they did the best that they could with the time that was given? Do you have an overall sense? Yes, and that's insecurity. Someone knocks on their classroom door, everyone gets tense. Someone knocks on a classroom door, and everyone in the classroom gets tense because they don't know who is on the other side of the door. I remember Columbine.
I do.
I'm sure many in the crowd, here at the forum today, if you don't know it, you can look it up. But it started the beginning of something that has plagued our country for a long time, and it recently hit very close to home for us. So, what legislation do you think can or will prevent the next school shooting? Or is there any? Ms. Keith, we'll begin with you.
Well, I think we can stop with the thoughts and prayers after the fact and start working on prevention. So what I'm proposing is that we insert the process of risk assessment before somebody gets their hand on a weapon. We have that system right now before you get into a car. We call it liability insurance. Everybody has to have it. It's not because you want to, but because when you get in your car, you are a risk to the people around you. The same concept applies to guns. When you own one, it becomes a higher risk to the people around you. And insurance companies are in the business and the process of risk assessment. They use actuarial science to determine who is and who is not a high risk. The beautiful thing about this is we know that insurance drives safer behavior. We wear our seatbelts. We have car inflatable, pillows to make sure that we don't get hurt. And not only that, insurance puts money behind you. But more than anything else, insurance puts up the red flags when they say you're too high of a risk in the first place. Because as much as we got to worry about our schools, we got to worry about every other building we've got. We can't shut down every building, every beach, every theater, every shopping center. The bottom line is the issue isn't only in our schools, it's everywhere. And the answer to the problem is risk reduction. That's the answer, prevention.
Risk reduction and prevention. What would you say?
I have a baby girl. I can't imagine sending her to school one day and not having her come home As Pam said, this isn't just about our schools. Since Columbine, we have seen mass shootings in our community centers, in our neighborhoods, at concert halls, even in our places of worship. We know exactly what we need to do. We need universal background checks. 96% of Americans agree. We need to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers and the mentally ill. We need to ban bump stocks. We need to get weapons of war off our street. We need to treat gun violence like the public health crisis that it is and fund the CDC. We need to make sure that we don't allow the NRA's plan to have concealed carry reciprocity go through and allow people from other states to carry their weapons into our streets. And by the way, we need to wrestle away Congress from the vice grip of the NRA.
Ms. Bear, while you're still standing, Ms. Bear, I heard a lot of we needs. We need. What are you going to do? You.
I'm going to sponsor legislation that does each and every one of those things.
Right.
We have in our current representative, Brian Mast, someone who has more than $32,000 in contributions from the NRA and its employees on his federal campaign finance records. We have someone who said he supported an assault weapons ban and then did nothing about it. Legislation is written. This can be done on day one, period.
Right. And I can't disagree that that can be done, but that only addresses about 156 deaths a year. The other 33,000 is from handguns, not AR-15s, not bump stocks, and so forth. So I think we got to think a little bit bigger if we want to see fewer gun deaths. And that's why I think it's important that we don't have background checks as the answer, because, again, who's doing those background checks? Right now it's gun sellers, as if they don't have a conflict of interest, or it's Adam Putnam's office, as if they didn't miss 250,000 background checks. The reason this isn't going right is because the whole system doesn't make any sense. We need a new system that inserts risk assessment that goes beyond just convictions, and that's exactly what insurance does. It pulls up red flags and it puts you on a continuum of risk, including the kind of weapon that you want to buy. So what I'm talking about is systematic change to address those 33,000 dead Americans. And let me say it as clearly as I possibly can. If you are okay with 33,000 dead Americans, you are no kind of patriot.
Ms. Bear, this is one of the key things that everyone has talked about, essentially, these background checks. Do you believe in them, whereas Ms. Keith, not necessarily so, because there's, like you said, there's a conflict of interest. So there's got to be some way to start this process out, no?
Background checks are necessary but not sufficient to deal with our gun violence problem. We know that from the number of people who haven't passed background checks or bought guns at gun shows or in parking lots and have then gone on to shoot, not necessarily up their schools, but their domestic partners, their neighbors, commit suicide. I don't disagree with Pam's idea about liability, and I would actually go one step further. I think we need to hold gun manufacturers liable for creating weapons that cause mass harm in our society. Liability is a mechanism we have in our judicial system to make sure that people are only making products that are safe and can be safely used. We know from the number of deaths we have in this country that that's not the case right now.
From a theoretical perspective, I think we've got a problem with that notion, because a gun is designed to kill. So if it does what it's designed to do, then it's not really a product's liability issue. I think there are things that we can do to make guns safer, right? Fingerprint triggers and other things. But I don't want to move the responsibility off of where it belongs. Right now, the kids in Parkland, who's paying their medical bills? They are, or we are, the taxpayers. Now, how does that make any damn sense? It doesn't. If you want to own a gun, then you have the financial responsibility about everything that goes from that gun. I don't want to shift it to the manufacturer. I don't want to shift it to the state. I don't want to shift it to anybody else. You buy that gun, you bought it, you break it, you own it. It is your financial responsibility. It's the way it should be. It's the thing that makes sense.
There is no incentive for gun manufacturers to start introducing safety mechanisms on their gun unless there is some form of liability for failure to do so. We see this throughout the consumer products industry. Gun manufacturers are one of a select group of industries that is immune from liability. Why are they immune from the liability? 3 letters, NRA. We need to stop making an exception for those who manufacture guns.
Your thoughts on Congressman Mast and his reversal with the AR-15, I'm curious.
You know, I think Congressman Mast is very good at doing exactly what he needs to do within the district. But you know a person not by what they say. You know a person by what they do. Now, if Brian was actually serious about bringing an end to AR-15s, he wouldn't be talking to us. He'd be talking to Kevin McCarthy. He'd be talking to Scott Womack. He'd be talking to the people of his own caucus who have the ability to actually move legislation. Have you ever seen Brian Mast actually talk to other Republicans and get them on board with his idea? That is the key sign of political pandering. He tells us what he thinks we want to hear because he knows his caucus will never back him up on it and they'll never hold him responsible for going against their wishes. He's just given permission to say what he has to say in a swing district. But Brian Mast, we see you and we see where your money comes from too.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. Obviously, a very heated issue. Obviously a very emotional issue. I remember the day, the prom for the seniors, and I remember having to write the newscast for that day. That I believe it was a Saturday, and tears came to my eyes to think of the fact that those 4 seniors wouldn't be graduating that day, wouldn't be going to prom that day. Obviously a very close to home emotional issue, but will there be an answer? Can there be an answer now? Columbine happened how long ago? More than 20 years? Date myself, 20? What is it that you can do and stand up here and say, I am going to do this, so the teens, who's ever a student in here, what is it that you're ever going to do that will make them not feel nervous once someone knocks at that door? I want to know what you're going to do, what your plan is.
There can be an answer. There has been an answer for decades. It is simply the case that Congress has refused to act. They refused to act after Columbine. They refused to act after Virginia Tech and after Sandy Hook and after Las Vegas and after Parkland. It is not that complicated. The legislation is written. Why are we not passing it? Congress is in the hands of the Republicans and they're in the vice grip of the NRA. So what will I do? I will go on the first day that I'm in office and co-sponsor bills that do exactly what I have just said. Universal background checks, assault weapons ban, banning bump stocks, an end to concealed carry reciprocity, proper funding for the CDC, end to immunity for gun manufacturers. These are things we can do if we have the political will in Congress. It is solely a question of political will, and that's something Brian Mast lacks. He can say things in public, but he never returns his NRA money, nor did he ever co-sponsor a bill that was already written that had more than 150 other co-sponsors that did exactly what he said he wanted. Banned assault weapons, but didn't confiscate them from their current owners. It is not that hard. You just need to send people to Washington who are actually going to sponsor it.
Sir, you asked me what I'm going to do, and the question is, what are we going to do? Because this millennial generation understands how to shut something down. I'm so proud of them. I don't know if you saw what they did in Washington, but they got themselves organized. They organized this here, right now. It isn't up to me, and it's certainly not up to Lauren. It's up to us. And the thing is, we are already seeing what they're doing. They made Publix back down from their contributions to Adam Putnam. We watched what they did in making the NRA lose sponsorship virtually overnight. Do you know how badass these kids are with social media? Do you know how quickly they can shame somebody out of their stupidity raising the moral conscience and putting up the mirror to somebody's face and say, look at yourself. What are you doing? It's not up to me. It's up to us. And I'm so grateful for it.
Thank you to the candidates. Let's give them a round of applause for their individual answers for that.
Derek?
Come on.
I love you.
Okay, so I believe the second round, it's like a game show here, the second round, no offense, will be audience Q&A. So whoever has questions, which ones? The other set of questions about the next ones. Which ones? We don't have to go into the second segment. Okay, I thought we have an hour? Yes. Okay, sorry. Moving on. Let's talk about something that really affects people, millennials, and that would be, and other people for that matter, not just millennials, lowering tuition for universities and addressing the student debt crisis. Ms. Keith, I think you say that there has to be a pass where college education is free, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
You know, I believe very much that education is the crane that lifts people out of poverty. It puts them on their path. And I believe that college education should be free, comma, for those people that are also willing to invest in their country. I don't think it should be free for any old person, any old place, any old time, because I went to college with people who didn't take their college seriously, who partied away that opportunity. And I don't think the taxpayer should pick up that bill. But if you are willing to serve in an area of critical need for the country, education, healthcare, environmental stewardship, technological research, if you're willing to do that, then we ought to be willing to invest in you. It's a win-win for us to get the best and the brightest to commit themselves to serving in an area of critical need for our country, and it ensures that they see that service to country is something of high value and to be rewarded and aspired to. I think that's the right answer.
Thank you. Ms. Baer, a pass for those who serve our country. A pass for those who serve our country?
I understand the burden of student debt. My wife didn't finish paying off her law school loans until last year, 10 years after she graduated from law school. There's no reason that we should be sending our students out into the working world with crippling debt at the very same time that there's a dearth of well-paying jobs. I agree that we need to find a way to make college tuition free and give a break to those who are committed to service. The way we do that is through programs that are loan forgiveness for those who choose to go into service afterwards. And as long as you are serving, as long as you're a policeman or a fireman or a teacher or a nurse, your loans are forgived. And if you choose to go into a different line of work, well, then you pay in for your education. It's a choice that individuals will have to make. But I also agree our government can be doing more now. Do you know that the federal government has the power to lower student loan interest rates, but they choose not to do so? We need to demand that. We need to pass legislation requiring that.
Thank you. Ms. Keith, I want to just go back to what you said originally. Can we as a nation afford to give that pass?
Can we afford to do it? I'll put it this way. We don't have a resource problem. We have a resource allocation problem. The people we send to Washington are sent there to make choices in our best interest. And somehow we find a way to cut taxes and cut revenue so that the Ferrari doesn't get lonely without the Maserati next to it. We find ways of compensating CEOs of companies that make all of their money off of taxpayer programs and give them $22 million bonuses and golden parachutes. We tax diapers, milk, and gas, but we don't tax shares in Pepsi-Cola.